But then, of course, days are busy. So I know that will be nice to have to share with people.
Absolutely. And we will be able to put it up on our website, hopefully in the next week or two. So we'll have a link to that too. Hi, Liza. Good to see you again.
Hey, Caitlin. Good to see you.
I was telling them before you got on that you were working with SparkY this past summer. We miss you.
Miss you guys too. It's nice we'll be able to work together a little bit more.
It is nice. I know. I'm so glad that it's, I don't know, the whole urban farming community is adorable. It's so nice and tight-knit.
It really worked out.
Right. Awesome. Well, as we're waiting for everybody to join us, if you are new or if you're, how about this? If you're an educator at a school program right now or at a distance learning program right now, go into the chat and let us know which program you're working with and how it's been going for you so far. I know that at SparkY, we pretty much all of our programs are doing distance learning right now, but we do have one program that's in person. It's the Oak Hill Montessori School, and it's out in Shoreview. And so tomorrow, we're really excited. We have a build day that we're doing with some of their middle schoolers. We've got about 13 kids we're going to work with and build a little aquaponic system in their grow dome structure. So it's going to be really fun. Ooh, all right. Kim Vickery, thank you for responding. Anishinaabe, I think I might have pronounced that wrong, but Anishinaabe, awesome, Academy. It's been great, been a great summer and got lots of produce, that's awesome. Kim, is your garden, has it been winterized yet? You can respond just by a shake of the head. Oh yeah.
No, not yet. That's coming up what needs to happen. But I did collect the basil seeds and the lettuce seeds, so, and I have some squash, so doing good.
That's awesome, I'm glad to hear it. Well, hopefully we'll be able to give you some tips today about some winterization techniques. Harvesting seeds is another thing. I should have included that in this webinar, but we've had some great success harvesting seeds too at the Culinary Center. And it's really fun to harvest seeds and to use that as kind of a learning experience for the kids. Jacqueline Duddingston, thank you for responding. It looks like you're working with Anthony. And she says, it was a good summer, got lots of produce and donated around Minneapolis. Awesome. And have sort of neglected the garden now that school started. I think that's a common occurrence. A lot of people tend to do that. I'm not sure what kind of shape it's in. Yeah, no worries. We'll give you some tips today about winterization, hopefully that can work out. And then one other idea we've thrown around at SparkY, and I'm not sure if the district is allowing this, but we're trying to create like learning pods, which are just groups of small groups of kids, less than 10 people, that can maybe go out and do some of these things like help clean up the gardens. Again, I'm not sure if the district's allowing that, but it might be something fun, or even an after school or weekend kind of thing that you could do.
I was kind of thinking of reaching out to some parents to see if they would be okay with that, with like a select few students possibly. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I feel like, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I know that there is one school in the district, I think, that has had a few students helping at it, a few at a time only, and socially distanced, but to help with winterizing and things.
And Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it's allowed to have some volunteers in the garden. And if they're students or parents or whoever, there's the certain, I think we talked about it in our last webinar, but certain protocols to follow and really to make sure that you're following them because everybody's watching. So, you know, we heard the district will hear about it if we're not.
There's protocol listed on the MPS School Garden webpage with kind of what you should think about if you're having, you know, whether it's adult volunteers or students in the garden. And there's also kind of some other like recommended best practices as well linked on that page from the city and the state. And if anyone has any questions about it, please feel free to reach out and we can either get you the answer or find a way to get you the right answer for how to do something safely.
Awesome. And then if you guys are interested in the webinar that we did a couple months ago about COVID and kind of options for gardening, that is posted on our website. If you go to sparky.org, you can find it there. And I don't think I've seen anybody join for a minute here, so let's maybe get started. I'm going to share my screen here with the presentation that we're going to present to you all today. Awesome. All right, welcome to the third webinar in the series, Produce Preservation and Garden Winterization. Today we're going to go over a few different techniques for how to utilize some of the produce that might still be in your garden, and then talk about some end of season winterization tips. So how can you prepare your garden not only for putting it to bed this season, but to prepare it for spring for next season. So most of you know me, I'm Caitlin, I work with SparkY, and I'm the Sustainability and Agriculture Director. And then I'm joined by two of my SparkY coworkers today.
My name is Kata Rolf, and I am the Education Director at SparkY.
And my name is Rylan Sorensen, and I'm the Sustainable Systems Coordinator.
Awesome. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with SparkY, but just in case you're not, we are a youth education nonprofit, and we focus on hands-on science and sustainability education. And this semester, or actually for the past 2 years now, we've had the awesome opportunity of working with the Culinary and Wellness Services Center to manage the garden that they've got in front of their building. So if you've ever seen that space, it's about a 3,500 square foot gardening space. It's beautiful, really neat. And traditionally, on a non-pandemic year, we would be using that space as sort of an outdoor education space where we can bring students on field trips or tours and use that garden to teach them all about science and sustainability, which is really fun. That's just one of the partnerships we've got going on at SparkY. We do all sorts of other things. We do school programming and we do a summer internship. We have youth job pathway programs happening, all sorts of things. So if you're interested in learning more about SparkY, you can visit us right here at sparky.org. So today we're going to go over a few different things. We're going to go over some food storage and preservation techniques. We're going to talk about some unique garden products that can be grown and used. Just before we started the webinar, we were talking about cucamelons, which are one of them. Just kind of interesting products that can be grown in your garden that are exciting for kids, and how do you use them. And then we're going to get into winterization and getting youth involved. So it's a weird year, it's a pandemic year. We can't necessarily have indoor or in-person classes, but there are certainly ways that you can get youth involved in some of these topics, and we'll talk about that later. At the very end, we'll do a question and answer for about 15 minutes. And then I'm sure we're all pros at using Zoom by now, it's been a minute, but I just wanted to remind you that we are going to be recording this webinar. We're going to post it online in the next couple weeks, and I'll also be sending it out to all of you, or at least if you signed up on our RSVP list, I'll be sending it to you after the webinar. When you joined, you were probably muted, yeah, and we do ask that you remain muted throughout the webinar just so that everybody gets the same experience. If you do have a question while we're going through the webinar, there's a chat feature. If you kind of mouse over, let's see, I believe the chat feature is at the bottom of your screen. You can click chat, and it should pop up with a little screen where you can type a question. We will have Ryland and Kata throughout the webinar answering each of those chat questions, so please use that. And then there's a raise hand feature. At the very end, when we do the question and answer, we'll talk about the raise hand feature, but you don't need to know about that just yet. And before we get started, I'm gonna hand it over to Kate with CWS to talk about some updates.
Great, thanks Caitlin, and hi everyone. Thank you all for joining for this today. So like Caitlin said, we just have a few updates that MPS Culinary and Wellness Services Department wanted to share with all of you. The first being that we are providing free school meal boxes for all youth 18 and under right now. So please help us share this information with families in our district and our community. Our meal boxes are free, again, for all youth 18 and under, so you don't actually have to be enrolled in Minneapolis public schools right now. And our meal boxes contain 7 breakfasts and 7 lunches with school favorites, fresh produce, including farm to school produce, whole grains, and a really nice variety of items. It's a lot of food. So please make sure that we get this information out to families so they can pick up. We're offering meal boxes for pickup at 29 sites across Minneapolis. Most sites are open 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. and a few are open 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. The other thing we wanted to share with you is that October is Farm to School Month, which is a time to celebrate local food, school gardens, and making connections with our local food system. So this is kind of a great way to kick off Farm to School Month a day early. And throughout the month, there will be ways to celebrate with Minneapolis Public Schools. So we'll be serving farm to school items in our meal boxes throughout the month. This week, we're kicking things off with watermelon radishes, apples, and carrots. And on the topic of apples, next week we'll be celebrating the Great Lakes Apple Crunch. So normally we would celebrate this in classrooms by serving local apples, and classes can crunch into the apples together. This year we're encouraging MPS schools and families to celebrate virtually and from home. So if you go to the Great Lakes Apple Crunch website, there's ideas of how you can celebrate, but we will have local apples in our meal boxes, so students can use that to participate, and schools and classes can organize virtual crunch events during class time to crunch with their students. And it's as easy as it sounds. You just take an apple and you crunch into it together, and it's just fun. So make sure to visit the MPS Culinary Wellness Services website to learn more about Farm to School Month and the Great Lakes Apple Crunch. And I will pass it over to Jenny, who's going to share some other fun things coming up this month.
Thanks, Kate. And I'll just say all the things that are coming out of Culinary and Wellness Services, subscribe to the Whole Carrot, especially funding opportunities and free webinars, and then events and opportunities. So that's a way, and you can find the subscription link on our website. And I saw Jacqueline's question about getting a copy of this presentation. Let's do that. We'll make a PDF of it and send it out. I think that will be pretty easy. Next week is also Walk and Bike to Anywhere Week. We usually would be celebrating Walk and Bike to School Day during this time in October. And so now it's just, you can walk and bike anywhere you want to go. We have information on our website and a lot of resources that can help you celebrate, your family celebrate, and then of course share with your school. So there's posters, and there's bingo, and there's a family guide, and there's just like a whole bunch of fun stuff. So plan to walk and bike. Should be a fun week. And then I want to introduce you to 2 of our interns. Eliza is our new Green Corps member, and she'll tell you just a little bit about herself, because she's going to be with us the whole year. And Savina we have for just a couple more weeks, and both of them are interested in working in your garden. And so if you are looking for some garden help, you can email Eliza, and she will she'll follow up with you. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Eliza. We're so excited to have you on our team, and if you want to just tell the folks a little bit about what you're going to be doing with us this year.
Hi, yeah, my name's Eliza. I use she, her pronouns. So this year I'm going to be working with MPS doing waste reduction, recycling, and organics management. So I'll be working on reducing the use of single-use plastics, making some disposal guides, and also doing a lot of outreach and education with students and families. I'll also be supporting everyone else on the wellness team at CWS, and Savina and I will both be helping out in school gardens.
Awesome. Nice to meet both of you. And from here, we'll get started with our main content.
Great, thank you everybody. Sounds like there's a lot of really fun events coming up. Right now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about pickling and fermentation. So Why pickling and fermentation? Well, if you have some extra veggies or extra produce that you don't know what to do with, you can spice up your life with some pickled and fermented foods, or it's also fun to do. And it's a great way to avoid unnecessary waste. So what can you pickle or ferment? There are many different things that you can pickle or ferment. Some of my favorites are asparagus, Brussels sprouts. You can ferment cabbage and make sauerkraut, or Napa cabbage and make kimchi, and many more things. Then you can visit the National Center for Home Food Preservation to learn more about other vegetables to pickle or ferment. Next slide, please. All right, so how does it work? Pickling is the process of preserving food in an acid solution, usually vinegar, or in a salt brine. And fermentation is an anaerobic process where microorganisms like yeast and bacteria break down food sugars such as glucose into organic acids, gases, and alcohol. And both methods are great for preserving food because with both techniques, acid is being used to delay the process of decay by killing off bacteria that could cause the food you are pickling to or fermenting to spoil. And the three acids that are associated with fermenting are lactic acid. So lactic acid is used for making sauerkraut, kimchi, and pickles. Ethyl alcohol, that is used for making beer and wine. And acetic acid is usually used for making things like apple cider vinegar, balsamic vinegar, things like that. And here are some quick tips for successful pickling and fermenting. You want to make sure you select recipes from approved sources, and you want to follow the directions carefully. You also want to harvest your vegetables within 24 hours of pickling, and make sure that your vegetables are thoroughly washed with clean water. And you also want to use soft water for a brine, and that's because if you use hard water, it may become your solution to become cloudy and discolor your pickles, altogether decreasing the quality of your pickles. So, and you also want to weigh down your veggies if you're fermenting. A lot of people use silicone cupcake cups or small dishes to weigh down the veggies, and you can visit extension.psu.edu for more information on successful pickling and fermenting. And here are some very basic steps for pickling and fermenting. Oh, I see there's a question, where can you buy soft water? I believe you can buy it at most grocery stores. I may have to follow up on that. But basic steps for pickling and fermenting. And a lot of this stuff I'm talking about here, Kato will go more in depth later. So first you want to make sure you sanitize your jars, wash your vegetables thoroughly. You want to make your pickle brine, then place the herbs and spices into your jars along with the vegetables, and then you add your brine to jars. And then you want to prep your jar for sealing. And after your jar is sealed, or if you think it's sealed, you want to check it. So if you are able to lift up the lid and it stays on there and the whole jar stays on there, then you should be okay to go. And then after that, you want to store in a cool, dry place for up to 1 year and enjoy. And find out more at the U of M Extension website.
Thank you so much, Ryland. And this brings us to our canning and jarring section. So before I get into this, I just want to say that canning and jarring is a topic that could easily take up an hour or 2 hour long workshop. It's really fun. It's pretty easy to do, but there are also really safe, precise ways to do it so that you don't introduce bacteria that could be harmful or even deadly to humans. So this is meant to be a brief overview of how to do canning and jarring. And if you're curious and you want to learn more, I would highly recommend doing a little bit more research before you try it out. So canning and jarring has a lot of the same perks that pickling and fermenting does. It helps you keep your food around longer, especially while you're in that harvest season in the fall. So once you put something in a jar, you go through the whole canning or jarring process. It'll actually stay in your pantry or your refrigerator or your freezer for 6 to 12 months. You can jar all kinds of things too: fruit, tomatoes, vegetables, jams and jellies, pickled or fermented foods. And a lot of other things too, soups, meat, fruit, vegetables. But today we're going to be focusing exclusively on things that are grown in the ground. So I'm not going to talk a lot about meat or anything like that. So basic canning and drying process is very similar to what Rylan just went over. So you're going to prepare your foods for storage by cooking them. Cooking, I said cooking and pickling together. Cooking, pickling, or preparing them for preservation in some other kind of way. So again, you might be making a soup, a jam, a jelly. You also want to make sure that whatever you are cooking, you wash that thoroughly beforehand. Lots of fruits and veggies that you buy at the grocery store are pre-washed, but it never hurts to give them a little extra scrub, especially in COVID times. You're going to sterilize your jars and lids. So even if you're buying fresh jars from the grocery store, you just bought a nice 12, 24 pack of ball jars and they're ready to go, you still want to do this sanitation process and buy a solution that can sanitize your jars for you. The importance of this is, again, killing bacteria or anything else that might grow inside the jar while you're storing it for a long time. So really important step, don't skip it. You're going to put the food that you prepared into your sterilized jar and seal it. And then you're going to do the other very important task that will help kill dangerous bacteria, which is heating the jar through either boiling or pressure cooking. So unless you're a bacteria that lives in hydrothermal vents in the ocean, boiling or pressure cooking is going to kill most things that are really dangerous to humans. The CDC recommends pressure cooking to get rid of all and any dangerous germs because it brings whatever you have put into your can or your jar to a higher temperature than boiling will. But they also say if you can't have access to a pressure cooker, boiling works, and their recommended guideline is 10 minutes plus an extra minute of boiling for every 1,000 feet of altitude above sea level. So Minnesota is really flat. You probably don't have to worry about it. But again, if you want to boil it a little bit longer, it doesn't hurt. It probably won't change the taste of your food that much. And then as Rylan says, you can check whether or not the seal has actually worked after you've boiled it by, I wish I had a lid on this, but you can just put the top part of the lid, the top metal part, pick it up by that metal lid, and if it stays on, that means that the seal is nice and tight. It's not going to come off and you've sealed it properly. After that, you store it for 6 to 12 months. Now the dangers of canning and jarring. So we need to beware of botulism. A lot of people avoid canning and jarring because of botulism. I stole this from the CDC because science, and I think they talk about it much better than I can. So botulism is a rare but potentially deadly illness caused by a poison most commonly produced by a germ called Clostridium botulinum. The germ is found in soil and can survive, grow, and produce a toxin in certain conditions, such as when food is improperly canned. The toxin can affect your nerves, paralyze you, and even kill you. You cannot see, smell, or taste botulinum toxin, but taking even a small taste of food containing this toxin can be deadly. I'll tell you an interesting fact about this. Botulinum toxin is Botox. So the same thing that people inject into their face to give it that youthful glow. When used properly, it can free you of wrinkles. When consumed, it's not so great. So I don't tell this to you as a sneaky, cheap way for you to get your own Botox. I tell you this to say canning and jarring is a really tough thing to do properly. And again, make sure you're doing your research and feel really confident about your practices before you try canning and jarring. So some safety tips. When in doubt, throw it out. This is always a great thing to do, even when you are doing something like pickling. If you notice like a cloudy, funky smell, or there's just something growing in there that you didn't see before, it's fun to reap the benefits of whatever you grew, but you can also throw it out. That's fine. Always follow USDA and CDC recommended guidelines for prepping your food. So again, we'll be putting this whole presentation on our website and sending it out to folks who RSVP'd. But you can follow those links. They have very lengthy step-by-steps on how to do that for preparing your food. Use tried and true recipes for canning and jarring. people try things out for a reason. If you're really experienced, you might be able to try your own method for canning and drying, but please follow the sterilization techniques and use those tried and true recipes so that you can be sure that you're preparing things in a way that other folks have tried before you, minimizing the likelihood of risk. Last but not least, heat is your friend. Again, there are very few organisms that live in hydrothermal vents. There are very few organisms that can survive boiling and pressure cooking. Heat is going to be a really effective sterilizer. So heat things up. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Caitlin to take us through some other preservation techniques.
Awesome, thanks Kata. Yeah, canning and drying can be really a good technique for using some of your produce. We're going to talk quick about root storage. I'm sure many of you grew some roots in your gardens this past summer. There's lots of different root vegetables, carrots, beets, onions, potatoes, radishes, parsnips, to name a few. I'm sure there's a lot of different things on this list that I didn't even think about. So roots can generally be stored a lot longer than, most traditional produce. It can be stored certainly longer than like peppers or tomatoes. And then another thing that kind of fits into this category, even though it's technically not a root, is a lot of different winter squash varieties. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about root storage. If you do it properly, it'll really increase the shelf life of your vegetables. In fact, a lot of people have been known to keep roots in a cellar in their basement for months on end. In fact, a lot of the time it can get you through the winter so that you have those nice sort of hearty vegetables to eat in the cold months. So most root vegetables do like to be stored in a cool, dark location, kind of around 55 or 60 degrees. Generally, people will use their basements for this, or I know when I was growing up, my mom would throw them into it's like a shoe closet that was off of the garage, but it was just an area that was cool and dark, and it did work really well for storing root vegetables. Humidity also helps. You don't want it to be too humid because, of course, that moisture can help break it down faster, but just the right amount of humidity will help keep that skin and the whole vegetable just moist enough so that it doesn't dry out and so that it lasts pretty long. You're also going to want to check on your root vegetables pretty regularly when you're storing them. I'm sure all of us have experienced the one time when you have a bag of potatoes or something, and one potato in the bag goes bad, and it makes the rest of them go bad much, much faster. Same thing can happen when you've got vegetables in your root storage. So you just want to check on them regularly and make sure you're pulling out any that look a little bit spoiled so that it doesn't ruin the whole batch. Here's a couple tips. When you're storing root vegetables, you want to cut that leafy green part off of it. So if you think about a carrot, it's got the underground root vegetable part and then that above ground leafy green part. And actually the leafy green parts can often be used for culinary purposes. I know a lot of people will use those carrot tops to put with basil and garlic and make a nice little pesto out of it. Or even things like radish greens or beet greens, you can stir fry those and make a nice little meal out of them. But those need to be treated as more of a leafy green rather than a root vegetable. So when you're storing root vegetables, cut those green bits off and only store the root portion of it. Some root vegetables have a curing step that you're going to want to go through before you store them. Potatoes appreciate a nice, warm, dark, humid area for a few days before they get put in their root storage location. So a lot of people will throw them into a box and then put them next to a radiator or a furnace, some area in their home that's just a little bit warmer. And they don't need long to cure. I would say probably about a week tops. And after that, you can, again, throw them in your root cellar or your basement or your cold shoe closet like my mom did. Garlic and onions are another thing that need that curing phase, but they actually need a curing phase that's almost exactly opposite from potatoes. So they like to be cured in a warm, dry, sunny location. And a lot of people, what they'll do is take a tarp or even just a piece of cardboard and throw it out on their driveway or on their lawn, and then throw all the garlic and onions on top of those, and just leave it there for about a week. The exposure to the sun and the dry conditions will kind of create that papery sort of shell that you think of when you think of garlic and onions, which is great. Again, they don't need too long. They need about a week. And then once they've got that outer shell, you can throw them into a box or a crate and put them in your root storage area. Boxes and crates are really a great option for storing root vegetables because they have a lot of airflow. You don't want, stagnant air or anything that's kind of anaerobic conditions, because that's going to lead to breaking down of the vegetable faster. But if you've got a lot of airflow, if you store them properly, root vegetables can truly last a very long time. Traditionally, or kind of historically, root cellars have been a thing that a lot of people have used. And actually, I know that especially in rural areas, a lot of people still do use root cellars. It's essentially an underground room where people can store their root vegetables. And it's underground because naturally underground it's traditionally more cold and dark and humid, which is great for root vegetables. And then especially in a place like Minnesota here, it's insulated underground. So although it gets very, very cold, it doesn't actually usually reach freezing temperatures. So root cellars are a cool place to store your vegetables. I know if you're like a lot of us, you don't have a ton of room if you live in the cities to actually build an underground root cellar, and that is understandable. There are some kind of makeshift kind of different ways that I've seen people go about it. I have seen one where somebody they found this old refrigerator that didn't work anymore. So they gutted the inside and then they buried the refrigerator. It was kind of in the side of a hill, so they still had access to the doors and were able to open it. That was one kind of interesting technique that I saw. And then I've also seen people just bury things like coolers or crates. If you really truly want a root cellar, but you don't have a ton of space in your backyard, you could do something like that. But again, if you don't have a root cellar and you want to store some roots, a spot in your basement is probably good, or any sort of cool, dark, humid spot in your home. So now I'm going to jump through 3 different storage techniques just really quickly that you're probably already familiar with, but I just wanted to give you a few more tips on them. Refrigeration is a great storage technique for many different fruits and vegetables. Almost everybody's got a refrigerator. I'm certain probably everybody on this webinar has stored produce in a refrigerator before, but just recently I learned some tricks with your crisper drawers that'll help that produce last even longer. So when we're talking crisper drawers, there's usually two crisper drawers in a refrigerator, and there's usually a slide on each one that can go from low humidity to high humidity. And for high humidity things, that would be things like leafy greens, lettuce, chard, strawberries, anything that is sensitive to drying out. Those are things that you can throw in the high humidity drawer and just move that slide over on your refrigerator over to that high humidity. And essentially that slide is just closing a window so that the humidity is locked inside of that crisper drawer. And when we talk about low humidity, as far as crispers go, low humidity is it's less about humidity needs and more about ethylene. So if you're familiar with ethylene, it's a gas that many different fruits and vegetables will release, and that gas will help the fruit or vegetable ripen faster. So bananas are a thing that does this. And if you think about, maybe you just bought a big bunch of green bananas, but you want to eat a banana for lunch tomorrow. If you take that green banana, throw it into a paper bag and close it, it will release ethylene inside the bag, and then that ethylene will be concentrated in there to help the banana ripen faster, which is great if you want a ripe banana for lunch tomorrow. Not so great if you want to store a bunch of vegetables all together in the one spot and prolong their life, because not only does the ethylene make the one vegetable ripen, it makes everything around it ripen faster too. So for things like that do release ethylene, you can throw them all in the same crisper drawer together and then put them on the low humidity setting, which again, it's just a slide. It's basically like opening up a window. So when you open that window, the gas can be released from that crisper drawer, and then things that are living in there, things that you store in there, will not be quite as sensitive to the ethylene that's being produced because it's being released immediately. So things that are ethylene producers include apples, pears, melons, avocados. Those are all things that you can store in your low humidity crisper drawer. And then when you're storing fruits and vegetables in the refrigerator, you want to make sure that they're clean and dry before you put them in the fridge. Cleaning is just because oftentimes there might still be little critters or bugs or pieces of dirt left on it that will not only be kind of gross if you put them in your fridge, but it can cause the produce to break down faster. So clean them first, and then you want to dry them for the exact same reason. If you put wet produce in your fridge, it's going to break down faster and it's not going to last as long. So the drier it is, most likely the longer it'll last. Freezing. So freezers are another thing that most everybody has, and it's a great way to store some of your either freshly prepared homemade goods or even just fresh produce. almost everything that Kata actually mentioned in the canning and jarring segment, all of those different things can be frozen as well. So I would encourage you all to try canning and jarring. It's not as scary or as odd as some people think. My mom, for example, she really doesn't think that she can can and jar things very well, which is so sad. But if you're like that too, if you're not sure about your technique or you're not ready to start canning and jarring yet, anything that you can can and jar, you can also just freeze. So when we're talking about freezing, there's a couple techniques that will help it turn out a little bit better. Blanching is one of those techniques, and not everything necessarily needs to be blanched before you freeze it, but for most types of produce, it is going to brighten up the color, it's going to clean the produce off, and it's going to improve the flavor. And actually, if you don't blanch certain things, like broccoli, for example, if you don't blanch that, then when you pull it out of the freezer and thaw it out, it's actually going to have a much more bitter flavor, and sometimes it can kind of get this like white sort of milky substance on it, which isn't harmful at all. It's just not the most appetizing looking. But blanching produce is really simple. You put a pot of water on the oven, boil it, or on the stove, I should say, boil it. And when it comes to a boil, you take that produce and drop it in there for anywhere from about 30 seconds to 2 minutes. If you visit this link in here, it'll tell you the exact blanching times for different types of produce. Pull it out, let it dry, throw it in a bag or a jar or some sort of an airtight container, throw it in your freezer, and it'll last for about 6 months to a year. And again, you can do this with homemade products too. So anything like sauces or soups or anything that you prepared, same thing. You can throw that in bags or any other container and freeze it. I really like to use Ziploc bags like these ones you see in the bottom here. And that's because, especially for like a liquid, like a soup, if you put them in these Ziploc bags, you can freeze them and they'll freeze flat. So they don't take up much room in your freezer. You can stack them pretty tall before they really start to take up a significant amount of space. So that's kind of nice. And then one thing that I really love doing with herbs and garlic, if you've got some of those left over, you can chop those up and mix them with butter or oil, maybe even throw a couple seasonings in there, and then throw them into an ice cube tray and freeze them. And then whenever you want to spice up some sort of a sauce or a pasta dish or anything like that, you can pop one of those cubes of herbs and garlic into there, and it tastes so good. And it's so simple, it's super easy. And you can even take those after you've had them in the ice cube trays, after they're frozen, throw them into a bag so they don't take up so much of that ice cube tray real estate in your freezer, and they store really nicely. And then dehydrating. Dehydrating is one of my favorite techniques for food preservation. It's so simple. If you have a dehydrator like this, or even if you don't, you can pick these up for 20 or 30 bucks from any sort of hardware store or home store. Dehydrating really just takes the moisture out of the produce, which allows it to last a lot longer. So things like fruits and vegetables, especially root vegetables like we were talking about, are great for dehydrating. When you're doing fruit, there's two kind of ways that you can dehydrate fruit. So if you dehydrate it fully to a crunchy sort of texture, you can add those crunchy bits of fruit to cereal or oatmeal or granola or trail mix. It's delicious. But if you allow it to not get quite that dry, if you leave a little bit of moisture in there, most of the moisture is sucked out and those sugars are highly concentrated in it. But then it takes on sort of a gummy flavor and it's delicious. It's just like dessert. You can almost trick your kids into thinking that it is dessert. And it's healthier, which is great. Same thing with root vegetables. Slice those up, anything like a carrot or potato or rutabaga. Slice them pretty thinly, lay them flat on your dehydrator. And when they're done, you can pull them out, sprinkle a little bit of seasoning, maybe a little bit of salt on there, but all of a sudden you've got a healthier alternative to potato chips. And they really are delicious. So there's lots of other things you can dehydrate, including meat, including all sorts of stuff. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit this link here, and it's got all sorts of recipes and techniques for additional dehydration techniques.
All right. Now I'm going to talk about some unique garden products and how to use them. And some of these vegetables I'm talking about probably aren't very popular or as common as like tomatoes or peppers, but I'll start with tatsoi, which is from the family Brassicaceae. So they're related to broccoli, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, things like that. They can be eaten raw or cooked. They're a great substitute for spinach or lettuce. and they can be steamed or stir-fried. And this is one of my favorite recipes here. It's tatsoi with oyster sauce, and it's a recipe from Mark Matsumoto from the Fresh Taste blog. And okra is a mucilaginous juice, I always have trouble saying that acts like a thickening agent, so it's common for foods like soups and stews and gumbo. And I attached the okra gumbo recipe from Tony Tipton on the bottom there. It complements many other foods like tomatoes, onions, corn, and fish, and is full of important nutrients like vitamins A, C, and K, and they're also high in antioxidants. All right, so Mexican sour gherkins, the cucamelons that we were talking about earlier, they're perfect for snacking fresh out of the garden, which some of you may have done, and they can be put in a fresh salsa or some type of dip to give it a nice bright flavor. They can be pickled and put in the salad, sandwiches, and wraps, and they can be used as an interesting and unexpected garnish in a summery drink. And I put the refrigerator pickle cucamelon recipe from Reese Ambrossi down below if you're interested. And finally is squash blossoms, which are best eaten fresh, but will keep in the fridge for about 2 days. They're a versatile ingredient for many types of dishes. They can be dried, eaten raw in salads, or sauteed. They're popular in Mexican and Italian cuisine, and a lot of times they're stuffed with herbs and cheeses, and they're fried, baked, or steamed. And the flowers can be added to pasta sauces, quesadillas, and in soups. And below I attached a link to a recipe from Nancy Lopez for squash blossom quesadillas.
All right, so we've got 2 sections, and then we'll be all set with our webinar today. So we're going to go over a bit of garden winterization practices. So we'll do some basic prep, dive a little bit deeper into a couple of other topics with garden winterization, and then talk about how to get your youth involved. So for garden winterization, there are a handful of things that you're going to want to be doing to put your garden to bed. Some are mandatory, some are optional. I guess everything is really optional when you're thinking about it, but best practices include harvesting your veggies and your fruits before the first frost. There are some veggies that you can grow in your garden, like kale, spinach, that will be a little bit more cold tolerant and might be fine after the first frost. However, things like lettuce, tomatoes, sometimes squash, anything that doesn't say that it's cold tolerant is going to need to come in before the first frost happens. You can look online for estimates of when it's happened in past years. It's always a little bit dicey because our climate is ever changing, and sooner the better, generally speaking. And on top of that, something that a participant reminded me of earlier was you can also start harvesting seeds. So a really fun seed to harvest right now is marigolds. So the buds of marigolds start to die and shrivel up and dry out. And if you pick off the buds, you can open them up and you'll have this fan of marigold seeds that you can keep and dry at home. This might be actually a great activity for youth to do. So if you walk around the neighborhood, lots of people plant marigolds because they're natural pest repellent. But as those marigolds start to die, that's a really easy thing to go walk around the neighborhood, pick one out, and see what seeds you can find. You're going to want to remove all of your weeds and anything else you don't want growing in the springtime from your garden. So I know that weeding can be a little bit tedious, but your future springtime garden will thank you for it. So again, anything that you don't want to overwinter, anything that you don't want coming up surprisingly in the spring, you should try and get that out right now. This is one of my favorite things to do in the fall. You can collect leaves to make leaf litter. So it's obviously leaf raking time. I don't know about all of you, but I've been watching my honey locusts drop tons and tons of bright yellow leaves at my house. And if you want to, you can actually save all of your leaf litter. So break it up just like you would any other year, put it in a giant black plastic bag, And then if you let that leaf litter sit outside for the next year, the leaves are going to decompose and turn into this really rich mulch that you can put into your garden come next fall or next spring. It smells amazing and earthy. It's really great to have around, and I would highly recommend doing it. It's an awesome source of organic mulch and compost. You're going to want to plant your bulbs, anything, again, that needs to overwinter that you actually want in your garden. So flowers, garlic, onions, anything that's coming in a nice little bulb shape is probably going to want to go in right now. You can get away with planting garlic in the spring, but I like to do it in the fall just because it helps me plan out my garden a little bit more and get ahead of the curve. This is an optional step. You can protect your perennials. So if you have any perennials that are going to stay outside, you'll often see people buying like garden cloth, covering them up, keeping them a little bit more protected from the elements for the winter time. If you have any potted annuals, you can move them indoors. They tend to be pretty happy. I'm going to attempt to move my begonias indoors, though I plotted them in the ground, so we'll see if that works. But my family always moves our geraniums indoors for the winter time. Then we have this beautiful greenhouse-esque like room where it just smells of flowers all winter long. So after you've done all of that, you're going to give whatever's left in the ground one last soak, turn the water off, remove the hose from the water source. Now, when you do this, make sure that you actually remove the hose and drain it. So if you're leaving your hose outside, like a lot of people do, the water can freeze. And when you're trying to water things in the springtime, you'll get nice little ice nuggets that are frozen up inside. And it's just kind of a long, painful process of getting all of the ice out and thawed. Sometimes the water is not necessarily warm enough to help do that job for you. And in a worst case scenario, your hose could actually split. So you're going to want to, again, detach the hose and bring it inside if you can. Last but not least, you're going to add mulch. So usually I use a garden hay, and there are specific kinds of hay that you want to use that don't have seeds. So there's a marsh hay, and then there's another kind of hay that is escaping my mind. But what that mulch is going to do is it's going to prevent soil erosion from happening. Keeps all of your nice healthy soil that you've hopefully been building up the past few years in place, provides a little bit more protection from the elements so it's not blowing away or getting too dried out. And it gives those bulbs that you did plant in the ground a nice healthy covering to keep it a little bit warmer. Again, more protected from maybe critters who want to be digging in and eating your bulbs. It's a great treat for a squirrel when they find a weird little flower bulb in your garden. Yeah, so that's that. We'll go on to the next slide. All right, so this is garden winterization level 2, I would say. If you want to, you can build a hoop house for your garden. I love hoop houses. They're really easy to use. They're really cheap to set up. All it requires is PVC pipes, plastic tarp, some twine, and then you can use brackets and bricks if you want to, but I've also made hoop houses that didn't have any brackets whatsoever. But the basic idea is that it extends the growing season for your cold tolerant plants. So I've been able to have kale, spinach, and a couple of other cold hardy vegetables grow inside a hoop house before. Provides some protection from the elements, keeps the air inside warm, keeps the cold out, helps prevent your soil from freezing. If you do this, you do need to still keep watering your plants, so keep that in mind. You'll have to find a water source that won't freeze outside over the winter time. Let's see. And then the other thing to keep in mind is depending on what kind of material you're using to put the tarp over, your plants might not actually be getting a whole lot of light. So it provides warmth, provides protection from the elements, but it blocks off access to natural water sources and natural light. So there are trade-offs. I generally love them. Like I said, I think it's really fun, and it's really fun to set up with youth. Again, if you can do that learning pod idea that we were talking about at the beginning, it can be really great. And it's nice to go outside and still be able to snap off a piece of kale when you want to cook something up. So I would say the pros outweigh the cons, but just some things to keep in mind again are light sources and water in the wintertime. The other thing that I really enjoy doing is planting cover crops. So lots of folks just rip out all of your plants, plant some bulbs, leave it for the wintertime. That's fine, but your soil actually loses a lot of its healthy structure, and it can lose a lot of the nice microbes that help give your soil like the life, energy, and nutrients that it needs to sustain plants in the springtime. So planting cover crops like winter rye or hairy vetch helps reintroduce some of the nutrients that have been eaten up by the crops that you planted this year and put them back into the soil. So for a cover crop, as soon as you're done taking everything out, you would spread it out just like you would with grass seed. So you spread it out, let it grow, and it doesn't keep growing in the wintertime, but it doesn't die either. It just kind of stays there. The roots give the soil more structure, and it is putting necessary nutrients back into the soil, namely nitrogen. So I really like this because, again, it's going to do a lot of what that mulch did. It reduces erosion, it's keeping your soil structure, and it's overall just helping your garden bed get ready for the springtime. So this is doing your future self a favor. Only thing to keep in mind is you want to be really diligent about pulling it out in the spring. Winter rye can very quickly take over your garden. So it's a lovely thing to have for the fall and the winter, but as soon as you know you want to start planting, try and get that stuff out. Last but not least, let's talk about getting youth involved. So we've talked about all kinds of things today, and it seems like most people on this call have some kind of connection to education right now, whether that be in classrooms, in after-school programs, what have you. So we wanted to explore a few different ways that you could virtually get youth involved in these hands-on inquiry-based activities that you can do. Pickling and fermentation is really fun to do with youth. Gardening is really fun to do. Putting the garden to bed is really fun to do. But we have this issue of distance learning and trying to figure out what can that look like, especially those hands-on aspects, while we're all still far apart. So a few ideas that we discussed amongst ourselves at Spark Y included found object hoop houses. So seeds and soil can be really accessible. Most vegetables that folks are buying from the grocery store, peppers, cucumbers, actually have viable seeds inside of them that you can grow at home. I've even bought apples before that actually had seeds that had already germinated and were growing inside my apple before. But if you ask youth to save some of those seeds, take a spoon, go outside and dig up some dirt on the sidewalk, might not be the highest quality soil, but it's still soil. Find a jar or cup. You can actually have them plant things and then use objects around the house to try and build a hoop house and see if they can get that seed to grow outside in the wintertime. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you can take tall structures, you can take old clothes, and you can try and use different materials and set up a hoop house that they think might block out the elements and help that plant grow and survive in the wintertime. So that's one thing that you could do. You can also do a mini winter garden. So Spark Y has been putting together STEM kits where we basically have a lesson in a box, all the materials that you need, and a lesson plan, and sending those home to youth. So we try and find cheap materials like plant trays, soil, seeds. And again, some of those things you don't even need. You can find soil, you can find seeds in places that don't require youth to be spending extra money. It just requires them to know how to harvest those seeds and where to get that soil. But you can do that same thing that I just talked about and try to get them to start a garden at home using seeds that they find in their fruits and veggies that are coming into the house. Next one has to do with food preservation techniques. Again, it's going to be a little tricky to maybe get jars and brine and the other veggies that you'd need for pickling out to youth. But food preservation is something that is prevalent and relevant across all cultures globally. So this one ventures a little bit outside of the realm of science and in more to the social sciences, just still a science, but you can ask youth to figure out what their family histories and relationships are with food preservation. I'll just give you one example. So my dad's side of the family, his mom is very Norwegian, very Norwegian. So we often talk about lutefisk, which is pickled fish that I really don't like eating, but it's something that has cultural value and tradition in my family. So in this case, I could go and ask my family about lutefisk and what that looks like. Some of my friends in the past are Korean, and they've taught me how to make kimchi and their family recipes for making kimchi, which is another form of food preservation that happens over time. That's a tradition that has been passed down as well. So this is all about discovering family histories behind food preservation techniques in your households. On a similar note, you could also have them go, like you could talk about food preservation techniques and then go into the pantry and look for cans or jars or the things that they know have used either canning or jarring, pickling and fermentation, freezing, what have you. What food preservation techniques are actually prevalent in the foods that they're eating at home. Last but not least is pickling something. So there are actually pickling methods that don't require a ton of materials. Quick pickling can just require salt in whatever vegetable you're pickling. I think that's lacto fermentation. That's a little bit trickier to do just because the salt ratio can get out of hand very quickly. And however, if your schools or whatever programs you're working with have access to resources that would allow youth to be able to receive a jar and some cucumbers or some cabbage from you, and maybe a nice little box of salt, it's a really fun thing to try with youth at home, especially while they're distance learning. And I believe that is all that we have for you today. So I'm going to pass it back to Caitlin, who will lead us through our Q&A.
Awesome. Yes, that's everything. Thank you all for joining us, and feel free to stick around for the question and answer. We'll spend maybe the next 10-ish minutes on question and answer. I think since we don't have very many people on the webinar today, we've got about 20 people, it looks like. Let's forget about the hand raising thing, and you guys can just shout out your question when you've got one. And just be sure that if you do have a question that you unmute yourself before you ask it. Awesome, and I'm gonna stop the screen sharing so we can all look at each other. Who's gonna be the first one with a question?
I put mine in the chat just because like I've been teaching all day and I'm tired of hearing my voice.
No worries, thanks Jess.
Fair. And the question is, how are STEM kits being distributed? It's a great question. Do you want me to take that one, Caitlin, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so for our STEM kits, we've been working with our school partners to figure out distribution. So SparkY has established partnerships with a few schools around Minneapolis Public School District. And we have been putting them together on site and then coordinating either a drop-off site with them. So often it will coincide with food pickup at schools or back to school nights at the beginning of the year. But we've been trying to layer it in with existing structures at school. If you're interested in trying to get that for your own school, we're currently setting up ways where you can get in touch with us, order them from us. Caitlin would actually be a great person to stay in touch with because she is actually in charge of our whole STEM kit operation. So you can email Caitlin if you're interested to learn more about that at caitlin@sparky.org, and I'll be putting that in the chat right now.
Awesome.
Does that answer your question, Jess and Jacqueline?
Yeah, so I will be in touch with
Great.
that. I guess since I'm already unmuted, I wanted to any suggestions for, so normally for the last 3 years, we've had like we call it a little harvest festival or put the garden to bed, depending on if there's enough to harvest or if we just need to, and that normally, you know, takes a crew of like 15, 20 people to do that. And it's just going to be, because it's like the 3 adults and then we get kids to help out. So I'm just going like, how are we going to actually put the garden to bed with just the 3 of us? Because we already spent like all summer, we went once a week to take care of our garden, but we didn't do too much, but we wanted to grow something in case we went back to school. So I just don't know what we can do, because like I don't want it to be awful in the spring, but I also don't want to put in another, like we obviously didn't get paid all summer for maintaining the garden, like.
Yeah.
And I've made lots of, like, I'm trying to make use of like all the vegetables that I did. Like I made videos of seed harvesting, so showing the students how to harvest seeds and then pulling seeds from fruits and vegetables. So I love those suggestions. I've made some great videos, which I'd be happy to share, that students could check out. But the physical labor of doing that, I don't know what to do.
I'll jump in quickly, Jess. So I'm not sure if you were on for the very beginning of the call, which is totally fine, but I did want to mention that MPS Culinary and Wellness Services has a new Green Corps member, Eliza, who's on the call, along with a dietetic intern right now, Savina, and they are interested and willing to help in school gardens. So if you would like some extra set of hands in the garden, you know, that can help do some work from social distances, please reach out to them. Eliza, could you maybe put your email address in the chat box? But if you reach out to Eliza, she and Sabina can coordinate with you and try to get you some help. And hopefully that's helpful. And if you need lots of hands, I'd be happy to come over at some point too.
And I don't think I'm over-promising, but Spark Y also has a volunteer network. So I think if there were, Caitlin, correct me if I'm wrong, I will tell all of you right now that I just started in July. So I'm probably the newest person on this call to Spark Y. But if there was a need for more hands, we might be able to coordinate getting volunteers from Spark Y to go and support with that.
Yeah, absolutely. One way that works really well, and actually we were talking about that a little bit before the webinar started. If you were to plan a work day and then reach into your network of parents or other teachers or community members to coordinate some volunteers on board to help, that would be great. And then if you do have a work day that you'd like to get more volunteers on board for, let us know at SparkY and we'll definitely post that on our volunteer calendar and try to funnel volunteers your way for sure. Awesome.
I have a question. I have a couple questions. So when you mentioned planting the onion bulbs, that's like if you have like an actual bulb of an onion already, right? Like I have a ton of onion seeds, so I would have to germinate those at some point. I mean, obviously that's not going to happen right now, but yeah, I guess my question is around, because I would love to plant like onions and garlic. I just kind of planted stuff like random little plants that had already grown a bit in the spring. So I didn't really plan very well in the spring. It just like all happened.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, if you are going to be planting garlic or onions in the fall for a spring kind of germination, that would be bulbs that you'd be planting, or like garlic cloves. When you pull it apart, you've got those little cloves that you'll plant. Those are great because they overwinter really well, and then they'll germinate and start growing next spring as soon as it's time for them to start growing. And they know better than we do since the weather changes so often in the springtime. But yeah, for seeds, I've thought about this a lot too. Technically, onions are a biannual vegetable product, which means it takes 2 years to reach full maturity. So if you start an onion from seed, that first year of growing, it will produce the onion bulb or the onion set, and then you can harvest that, or even just leave it there in the ground and let that overwinter, and then the next season it'll germinate and start to grow again. And then by the end of the second growing season, then you'll have an onion that you can harvest. So it does take a lot longer from seed. You can also, I believe, in the spring, if you start early enough, maybe around like March or April, you could probably plant those seeds and get a little tiny bulb that you could have available to plant by like May. So that might work too. But yeah, in general, when we talk about fall planting, it's the bulbs or the sets, the onion and garlic sets.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, great question.
I had another question. So we have like a 3 compost bin type like boxes, and they're like really full of just like weeds and stuff right now. And so I'm just wondering what that looks like when we start pulling stuff out after harvesting what's actually there. I have a feeling I also have a lot of dead like tomatoes and stuff because I have been neglecting the garden, and I had like maybe 3 parents helping me this summer. So I don't know. I guess I don't know what to do with all of the stuff that I'm going to be getting and pulling out. And do I just throw them in the compost beds? Like, how do I do that?
Yeah, that's another great question and something we're kind of struggling with ourselves. I have a few ideas to throw out at you. The first one is, yeah, when you pull things out of the ground, like let's say a corn stalk or a tomato vine, you want to break those up into as small pieces as you possibly can, and that will allow it to break down faster. So like you mentioned, your compost bins are full. Ours are too. It's unfortunate, but part of the reason that ours are completely full is that we didn't cut them into small enough bits when we threw it in there. So now we still have giant like tomato branches left over from last year because they didn't break down in the amount of time that we had. So I would recommend try to break it down into small, tiny little bits. And then if you've got a space near your garden, theoretically, instead of throwing it into the bin that's already full, you could throw all of this additional compost that you're getting just into, they call it a windrow or just a big pile next to your compost bin, and that could essentially be a compost pile that you've got. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily like to have just a big dump load of compost next to them, and I get it, that's fine. Another thing you could do, if you do have access to a trailer or a truck, you could load it all up, and a lot of cities have compost sites where you can bring it and dump it. So those are all great options. I also know if you have access to, there's a listserv through the University of Minnesota. It's called SUSTAG, or the Sustainable Agriculture Listserv. And there's lots of farmers on there that actually like really, really love compost and will come miles to come get your compost. So if you have the ability to join that listserv and post on there, or even reach out to me, I can post on the listserv for you if you'd like. But there are usually farmers that will come and get that compost from you and use it in their own gardening endeavors. Any other ideas out there? We can make this a collaboration opportunity. Rylan, Kata, no? Yeah, those are just a few ideas.
I guess one other idea is compost is a really nice balance between nitrogen, goopy nitrogen things and dry carbon things. So generally when compost isn't breaking down, it's because there's too much of one or the other. So if you have any nitrogen laden things, so again, that's going to be anything goopy, like, I don't know, apple scraps, banana peels, coffee grounds. Coffee might be less goopy, but anything that's going to add a little bit more moisture to your compost pile will also help it break down faster. So one thing that might be happening is you're just putting too much carbon in, and like the compost pile is sitting there with all this carbon, wondering what to do. Not that it's sentient, but you get what I mean. Yeah, so in addition to breaking it down into small pieces, I'd also just recommend finding other things that you could put into the compost bin to encourage it to break down a little bit more quickly and give you that rich, luscious compost in the springtime.
That's a great idea. Actually, at Sparkwire, we're lucky that we have access to aquaponic systems. We'll take all the like algae or fish poop and all that grossness and throw that in our compost bins, and that's like a bacterial kickstarter. Compost loves that. Anything that's already kind of like gross and breaking down. Awesome. Oh, or worms. You could throw worms in there. They'll eat all the little critters and all the little bits.
Red wigglers are really fun. They're not native though, so gotta be. Although apparently most worm species aren't native at this point, which is wild.
And what's nice about red wigglers is that they don't burrow, so they won't ever
Mhm.
be able to get deep enough into the ground where they'll survive a winter in Minnesota. That's really nice.
And they like living right underneath the leaf litter
Mhm.
in warmer places.
Awesome. Well, before we wrap up, are there any last final questions? And if you guys do think of any other questions, by all means, email me, email Ryland or Kata or Kate. We can get you hooked up with the answers.
I'll put my email in the chat. I'll put
Thank you so much, Caitlin and Katja and Rye and Spark Y. That was great. Thanks for sticking around a few extra minutes too. I thought those questions were fantastic.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us and letting us do these webinars. It's so much fun.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.